I actually remember that as a kid, I wanted to become a game designer. It just seemed like the dream job where fun people come together to make fun things. But as the veil behind game designing and being a game developer got peeled back, it became abundantly clear that there's more to that profession than meets the eye. It's not all that it's made out to be. It wasn't that long ago that we learned about the troubled development history of Anthem. Not only did it pave the way for the release of a half-baked, woefully compromised product, human beings were genuinely suffering behind the scenes with stress, anxiety, depression, and mental breakdowns. More recently, Kotaku editor Jason Schreier put his sights on tackling the troubled development and abusive work environment at Treyarch during the development of Black Ops 4. In this latest expose, Jason revealed how contractors and QA testers specifically were pretty much treated as second-class citizens by the core team, and how behind-the-scenes mismanagement led to Black Ops 4's development pivoting twice, resulting in the campaign being scrapped and Treyarch staff having to crunch for months on end. Jason interviewed 11 current and former Treyarch employees who felt they had to share behind-the-scenes goings-on at the studio. One of the first things the article highlighted was how demoralizing it was for QA testers to hear the news that Activision had awarded their new CFO at the time, Dennis Durkin, $15 million in cash and stock bonus. That $15 million was basically a welcoming gift for the executive who essentially took the place of Activision's former CFO, who had been poached by Netflix. Contractors were understandably frustrated that an executive could so effortlessly get that kind of bonus, while contractors busting their asses continued to work for $13 an hour, roughly minimum wage in California, which is where Treyarch and Activision are based. There were some contractors who might earn higher depending on department and experience at the company, up to $30 an hour, but generally $13 an hour was considered the base wage. The general sentiment was that Activision could easily afford to give testers and contractors, these people busting their asses off and still barely getting by, a sizable bonus if they actually cared, judging by how easily the company can afford to throw around $15 million. But instead, all that money and then some is being prioritized for top executives with already deep pockets instead. Now, there is a way for contractors paid on an hourly basis to get higher pay by working more hours. The way it worked was that those who worked past 8 hours would get paid time and a half, and those who worked past 12 hours would get paid double time. These were hours that those on the lower end of that $13 to $30 an hour spectrum had to work, as getting that extra time and that extra pay was the only way to afford living in Los Angeles, which is one of the most expensive cities to live in the world. Hell, some testers still had to go work second jobs with the salary they were earning to keep up with living expenses. This all led to a lot of unhealthy side effects. Some testers started drinking to cope, others experienced panic attacks, burnout, dissociation, and a general loss of passion. The QA testing department in particular suffered the most during the tail end of Black Ops 4's development, as well as in the months after the game's launch. Making matters worse was that QA testers kept being told that crunch would end after various checkpoints, but that grind only continued. So they were told crunch would end after launch date, but then after that they were told that crunch would end after winter break, then after summer, and the goalpost just kept being moved while they continued to grind away. One developer from the core Treyarch team spoke to that effect, talking about how sorry they felt for QA, how frequent updates were after launch, which kept QA testers crunching further. Each new build only got buggier and more broken because of time constraints, with testers not having enough time to test every nook and cranny due to how frequently the updates were rolling out, so that put even more of a strain on QA. But it's not just that QA testers had to work ridiculous hours, they were across the board treated like lesser people. When there are parties held in celebration of something, everyone is allowed to partake except contractors and QA testers, who were only allowed to stay at these parties for 20 minutes and not drink like everyone else. Testers were also segregated from core Treyarch developers, meaning they were not allowed to speak to them directly, which meant that liaisons like QA leads had to relay information back and forth. Testers also didn't get get basic accommodations like parking in the premises, with such privileges only being reserved for core team members, with testers being forced to park at another lot that's a 10-minute walk from the office. When food was catered, testers who work on the second floor were told the food's off limits and for the development team on the first floor only. There were times in which after an hour they could see if there were any scraps left, but other times they were just told they cannot touch the food at all. When food isn't catered, unlike core developers who get to take breaks and eat whenever they feel like it, testers had specific mandated unpaid break hours. Treyarch couldn't even do testers working night shifts from 10 p.m. to 10 a.m., the courtesy of leaving the air conditioner on, which made for grueling hot summers, especially with all this hardware inside QA testers' crammed rooms, generating additional heat. These rooms, or bays as the article called them, were apparently meant for 6 to 7 people, but were fitted with groups of 10 to 12 QA testers. One tester who spoke to Kotaku likened the whole experience to working at a sweatshop, stating that such a comparison is actually not much of an exaggeration. Testers did eventually manage to convince Treyarch to leave the air conditioner on after 2 months of emailing them, but even then they'd occasionally forget to leave the air on. Testers also wouldn't get timely notice about upcoming work shifts, with one source stating that they'd find out on Friday night whether they'd be working weekends. Contractors also never got a slice of the bonuses being distributed earlier this year for Black Ops 4's launch. Instead, a lot of that money went to Treyarch heads such as directors, leads, and executives. Furthermore, unlike the core team, contractors had limited sick days and no paid time off. And as for holidays, they got paid leave for only 6 days throughout the year, including on 4th of July, during Thanksgiving, and either Christmas or New Year's, but not both, according to the article. Things then got worse when a policy change mandated that contractors had to work 510 core hours over the course of 13 weeks straight without missing a beat to qualify for paid holidays, which meant that one minor case of tardiness or one missed day, even if that day was missed for a good reason, like being sick, would mean paid holidays would be revoked for that individual. Sources noted that even the most punctual of contractors may arrive a little late one day or miss a day because of some emergency, being sick, whatever. So after this new policy was put in place, contractors pretty much stopped getting paid holidays. There's also the matter of contractors getting meager benefits and far less comprehensive health insurance plans compared to the rest of Activision employees. On top of all that, when Treyarch sent out surveys to gauge the company's health, when meetings were held about upcoming projects, contractors and testers were completely excluded. That's why testers only learned about Treyarch helming a new Black Ops via a Kotaku article that leaked some of that information. Now, Kotaku attributed Treyarch keeping contractors at arm's length when it came to sensitive information to the company wanting to prevent leaks, especially given there have been past instances in which a member of Treyarch's QA team leaked information. But even setting that aside, looking at the broader picture in terms of how contractors and testers are treated, based on this report by Kotaku, it is abundantly clear that they're straight up seen as essentially lower-class peasants, while the core Treyarch team and Activision employees are treated and act like royalty. One core Treyarch developer admitted to Kotaku that QA is often the butt of a joke around the studio, with snide remarks constantly being thrown around at the QA department. There were some Treyarch developers who did express they felt as though some QA testers were unskilled and inexperienced, which may have led to some bugs going through when a patch or update went live. But on the other side of the fence, plenty of times QA testers simply didn't have time to test everything out because new builds kept being pushed out so often. And when something goes wrong, when a patch goes out, it's QA that gets the brunt of the blame. This is all further exacerbated by the fact that QA is restricted from talking to core Treyarch developers. There's a literal barrier of segregation between these two groups of people imposed by management, which means that they cannot communicate and work together and get along. The two sides are even given different colored badges to really drive the point that they're two different categories of people and employees, with core team members getting blue badges and contractors getting orange badges. Core developers were also told to not speak with QA, and this is strictly enforced enough that both sides feel like if they try to directly talk to one another, their jobs might be compromised, that they'll get fired. So on the off chance that they do decide to communicate directly, they'll do so in secret. This segregation ultimately results in a worse and buggier game, as low morale and poor working conditions means worse performance across the board among QA testers, and the inability to directly communicate acts as this roadblock, an obstacle between a team that should be working in cohesive unison. This is all things that contractors and testers want to communicate to leads, directors, and higher-ups at Treyarch, but they feel like they won't be heard anyway, or that if they do raise concerns, that they'll risk losing their jobs and that they might be easily replaced. There were a few contractors who did go to higher-ups to ask for a raise or for a bonus, but they were told that restrictions by Volt, the outsourcing company these contractors technically work for, made that impossible. That's important to note. These contractors aren't permanent employees of Activision. They are outside hires from Volt. But that hardly justifies how contractors, whether we're talking about testers, the most mistreated of them all, or members of other departments, are seen and treated as lesser beings. This goes doubly true for contractors who've had years of experience in their field and still get paid meager hourly wages compared to permanent Treyarch employees doing the same work. Some contractors put up with all this crap because of the hope that they'll be hired by Treyarch on a more permanent basis, but such an occasion is rare, so many see this as Treyarch dangling a carrot in front of contractors, a carrot that most of them just won't be able to get a bite of. Now, this is all just on the contractor side of things, but core developers also had to deal with their fair share of pains as a result of mismanagement. Mismanagement that led to the campaign being cut from Black Ops 4. According to Kotaku's report, the original plan was for the game's campaign to be centered around this 2 versus 2 mode that would be played with AI bots or with human players, where each side would be from a different faction, and each side would have to complete diverging objectives for a specific target. So kill someone versus defend someone, and completing these missions would progress the story. Leading up to the holidays of 2017, things seemed to be going smoothly. Higher-ups seemed happy with the work, but then after the holidays, during the beginning of 2018, leadership began notifying everyone that the campaign might have to be cut due to technical concerns, time constraints, and feedback from playtesters who said that the campaign's gameplay felt repetitive. The plan then became to scrap this 2 versus 2 idea and go for a more traditional single-player campaign with major set pieces and all that. But at this point, Black Ops 4 had been 2 years into development, and what was originally supposed to be out by November 2018 was pushed forward to October 12th by Activision after the publisher discovered Red Dead Redemption 2 had been delayed from spring 2018 to October 26th. Basically, Activision wanted to get the game out before Red Dead Redemption 2 in order to generate greater potential sales, so they gave the development team less time to complete the project. At that point, the team realized that they were not going to have enough time to complete any kind of campaign, and that led to the campaign's unceremonious termination. And what we got instead was the last-minute Battle Royale mode we now know as Blackout, whose development started 8 to 9 months before launch. So from February to October 2018, it goes without saying that Treyarch developers were subjected to extreme crunch as a result of 2 major shifts in the game's tumultuous development. Crunch that wasn't mandatory per se, but was expected of them lest they be perceived as less valuable employees. And of course, contractors, playtesters in particular, had it even worse, given that on top of long hours, they had to cope with an abusive work environment in which they were constantly mistreated and viewed as lesser beings. Now, whenever topics like these are brought up, I keep hearing people make the excuse that this is common for contractors to be treated this way as lower echelon employees. Mistreatment of QA testers in particular is very common in the video game industry. But to people saying, oh well, what are we going to do? This is just what happens. This is normal. I say just because a practice is common doesn't make it right. And that's the reason to speak out against crap like this, to denormalize this kind of toxic and abusive work environment for contractors and similar employees, for QA testers and such. And even those who had the luxury of being core developers at Treyarch also suffered their own fair share of pains with having to crunch and all that. The ultimate responsibility with all this lies on Treyarch and Activision's managers, leads, and higher-ups who are all too content to foster this kind of abusive work environment for certain groups of ground floor developers and workers while they reap the rewards of their hard work. It is higher-ups who ultimately decided to mandate segregation between QA testers and the rest of the core team. It is higher-ups who lay out these terrible conditions under which contractors work in. It is higher-ups who are neglecting the pleas of workers who feel like they aren't being heard and who feel expressing concerns will cost them their jobs and their livelihoods, which is why they resorted to contacting Kotaku instead of going to upper management to express their sentiments about the state of their work environment, all of which contributed to an unfortunate friction between core developers and contractors, especially QA testers who are considered to be the butt of the joke despite the key role that they play in the game's development. Activision and Treyarch are overtly categorizing their employees between high class and low class, and they treat each respective group as such. As a result, everyone at the studio gets into this mentality. They all treat this like it's normal, and it fosters this environment where some people deem themselves as higher human beings than others. And all that does is create a lot of in-office politics and a lot of toxicity between these two groups of people, and that's not ideal when they're all striving towards a common goal. Now, shortly after Kotaku released their story, Treyarch studio heads Dan Bunting and Mark Gordon sent out the following email to all staff to address the article, stating, quote, "Team, today Kotaku published a story that explores a number of reported behind-the-scenes issues in Black Ops 4's development. The first and most important statement that we want to make to the team is that, as managers of this studio, we take the well-being of every single individual working here very seriously. We have a vision for the future of this studio that includes significant improvements to work-life balance, and we plan to achieve that through better project planning, streamlined production processes, and rigorous decision-making timelines. It is also our intention to maintain our commitment to increase transparency. Getting there will require time, hard work, and commitment. Most of all, it will require open communication. If you ever feel like your needs aren't being met, please do not hesitate to communicate actively with your manager. No one should ever feel like they don't have options, can't talk openly, or that the only choice is to take their concerns to the public. These conversations should always start with an honest dialogue with your department manager, and if that's not working, feel free to reach out to one of us. Game development is a wildly complex art, and it requires a diverse set of people and skill sets to do it successfully. It's important for all of us to foster a studio culture that treats all team members with respect. We appreciate the contributions made by all parts of the team in the name of the games we make. Sincerely, Dan and Mark." Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of, oh, this isn't right, and oh, talk to us, don't talk to the public, but not a lot in the way of solutions and recompense or tangible calls to action. I don't think they understand the point that developers don't feel like they can talk to upper management because of various risks that could present, or because the culture of this studio hasn't fostered an environment where it feels like it's safe to communicate one's feelings about their experience at the studio. When you aren't inviting contractors to meetings, when you aren't feeding them properly, when you're cramming a dozen of these testers inside a hot room meant for 6 or 7, when you're doing things that are not even basic human decency, I can hardly see why they would feel safe about going to you guys. When higher-ups cannot conform to basic etiquette in terms of how they treat their employees, I cannot imagine why contractors would feel like it's safe to talk to them, especially when they've tried to talk to them and their feedback has gone ignored anyway. I guess only time will tell if this kind of media exposure will get studio heads at Treyarch and Activision to be more proactive about how they treat their employees and ensuring that everything's well on that front. But do keep in mind that to many Treyarch developers, Black Ops 4's troubled, tumultuous development felt like history repeating itself. This has happened before. During Black Ops 3's development, similar scope changes happened. There was supposed to be like an open world structure, but last minute they pivoted, and so that caused a lot of work to be lost and people having to make up a lot of hours, and that led to crunch. And despite higher-ups having promised developers and employees that the same wouldn't happen with Black Ops 4, that they would prevent this kind of crunch from happening again, it happened again. So given Treyarch's track record, Dan and Mark's letter to the team making vague promises about improving work and life balance, project planning, production processes, so on and so forth, do not inspire that much confidence. This goes doubly true when you consider that Treyarch is returning to a 2-year development cycle for their next Call of Duty slated for 2020, whereas their last 2 projects allotted them 3 years, so they're reducing development time for these titles, and that is only going to perpetuate further crunch. Granted, they are getting some backup from Sledgehammer and Raven for this next game, but still, they have a year less than usual to put this game out there, and layer that on top of Treyarch's track record of crunching employees, of making promises and then breaking them. Yeah, none of this is particularly reassuring, is it? But beyond improving development process, what a lot of people expressed to Kotaku was that they want a modicum of human decency to be standardized across the entire studio, across all people. They want all humans working there to be treated like humans, for everyone working on the same project towards the same goal to be treated like equals, which I think is a very fair request. Obviously, there are people with different roles and different skill sets and different disciplines. There are leads and there are people who work under leads. I get that there's a structure, but having a higher role doesn't make you a higher level human, you know what I mean? You still have to treat people under you as equals, like they are humans. Across the board decency in a work environment goes a long way, makes a world of difference when it comes to morale and team unity, things that can only bolster a game's development process and the overall quality of the final product. And I'm not just talking about Treyarch here, this goes for all game development studios. We have heard, for example, what happened with BioWare and Anthem's development via Jason's expose, but I suspect that as this issue keeps getting more and more spotlight, as more developers keep speaking out, this is going to continue snowballing. I suspect we'll keep hearing more and more stories from developers across all kinds of different studios in the gaming industry, and the hope is that this will all lead to an industry-wide drastic change when it comes to employment practices. Because right now, as the gaming industry stands with how they treat talent and employees and developers, this is just not sustainable. People are going to keep burning out. We're going to see more talent leaving than entering. People who want to grow up to become game designers may start hearing about the stories and pursue other avenues instead because they don't want to take the chance of having to work in such a terrible environment. The games industry needs to recognize that the lifeblood of these games are the developers. They're the ones who bust their asses to bring these visions to life, and developers need to be in high spirit to do their best work. But right now, all the games industry seems to be doing is breaking the spirits of these developers, woefully unconcerned about their mental and physical health. As a result of all of this, unionization is a topic that's coming up a lot these days, and yeah, I can see unionization becoming a very real possibility in the not-so-distant future, and if that's what it takes for developers to have more power and more say, more of a voice when it comes to work environment in the games industry, so be it, whatever it takes to break this horrible cycle. These are one man's thoughts and opinions on the whole situation. I'd love to hear what your take is on Kotaku's latest expose on Black Ops 4 and Treyarch in the comments below. With that, I would like to end this news update and discussion video. Thank you for tuning in. To be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.